We all make some pretty dumb mistakes. In fact, over the years, I've done some pretty dumb things. I have forgotten to pay bills. I have given some extremely boring sermons. Nobody ever tells you about it the day of the boring sermon, but they'll tell you, like, remember 5 years ago when that sermon was so boring we almost all fell asleep? I've said some things to people that hurt them. I've broken relationships. I've done some things that I regret. I've made some absolutely incredibly bad choices. In fact, let me tell you about one. I was 20 years old. I was young and crazy and not very smart at the time, and a friend of mine wanted me to get on the back of his motorcycle and go for a ride at midnight in the middle of Wyoming. We were absolutely in the middle of nowhere in Wyoming, and it was only dirt roads. And I got on the back of the motorcycle, and my friend was going about 45 miles an hour on a dirt road on a motorcycle. And I just want you to, anyone that's ever done that at night, that is a very scary experience. And it was kind of cool because we were going down the road so fast, and you could feel the wind, and you could hear the sticks as you would go by, and you could every once in a while hear some wind or some noise or anything like that. And then all of a sudden, it seemed like time had completely stopped, and the next thing I heard was this amazing thud and this terrifying screeching sound and then an incredible pop. And it took us a while for the adrenaline to get out of our body for us to realize what had just happened. We were going 45 miles an hour down a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, and we didn't see a cattle gate. This cattle gate was made out of barbed wire and wood, and we hit that thing so straight, so hard, so fast that the gate just exploded. And afterwards, I thought to myself, I am so lucky that I did not get decapitated. All of us make unbelievably dumb mistakes. In fact, I want to show you this. Now this doesn't work. I'll do it without it, this one. Okay, did you turn that? Okay, thank you. This poor guy here is about to hit the rake and hit himself on the head. This is broken too. Imagine this guy. He missed something. Take a look at what he missed. He missed a pole in the middle of the water. Okay, go to the next one. Imagine this poor guy here. He didn't pay attention to minor details like how tall his truck was or how low the entrance to the bridge was. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to get through the rest of the sermon. Would you like to have a do-over button? Wouldn't it be cool to just if every time you made a mistake, you could go into a special room in your house and then you could push the do-over button? If you're anything like me, you would push that button over and over and over because of all the dumb mistakes that you make. Every time you make a poor decision or hurt somebody, you just go into the other room and you push the button. One of the things I would love as a pastor is have the ability to, whenever somebody else comes into my office and they're telling me about something that they've done that's really hurt people or how they've messed up, to be able to move some books out of the way and say, here, all you have to do is hit this do-over button. You get a fresh start. Everything's really cool. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. If you had a fresh start, if you were able to do things over, would it make any difference? If you had the opportunity to completely start from scratch or go back into your life and erase one mistake that you wish you never made, maybe it was a weekend or maybe it was a really dumb decision or it was a partnership that you got started or something else that you did, if you had the opportunity to go back in time and start over again, would it make any difference? Unfortunately, as a pastor, thank you, Dan. You going to fix it for me? Yes. That was cool. Unfortunately, as a pastor, one of the things I've realized is that very few people are able to start over and do anything differently. Just because you have experience doesn't mean you learn anything and doesn't mean that you do anything different. Most often, when people are giving a second chance, whenever they have somebody come alongside them and completely take them out of debt, they end up going right back in debt. Even when people win the lottery, all of a sudden something takes place where they end up losing all of the money. Just because you experience something doesn't mean you'll learn anything and doesn't necessarily mean that you'll do anything differently. The only thing worse than making a dumb mistake is making the same mistake over and over and over. Some of you are like me, and in your life, you've made one mistake over and over and over again. In fact, whenever you have a conversation with your spouse, things start to go south, and you make that same mistake over and over and over, and you never learn anything about it. Today, we're going to look at one character in the Bible, and his name is David. So turn, if you will, to 2 Samuel chapter 6. We're going to start with verse 1. 2 Samuel chapter 6. And the reason I want to take a look at David is because he learned something that was absolutely important. If we pay attention this morning, we will be able to ensure that we do not make the same mistake over and over and over again. For the next 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to talk about a character, and I'm going to kind of act like I'm that character. So I want you to know for like the next 3 minutes or so, I'm going to be a guy named Ohio, not to be confused with Ohio. This guy was definitely not an Ohio State Buckeye fan. This guy's name was Ohio. His father's name was Abinadab. And in the nation of Israel, something happened to this guy, and I'm going to talk as if I'm him. It was weird, and it was interesting because my dad had people move the Ark of the Covenant to our house. We had this humongous hill on the side of our house, and they brought the Ark of the Covenant, and they placed it in my backyard, and every day I got to see it. And I knew something was unique, and I knew something was different because this Ark had the very presence of God, and it kind of glowed, and it was really weird, and it was intense. And for 30 years of my life, the nation of Israel completely ignored this Ark. The leader at that time, Saul, never once consulted of God, never once wanted to know about what God was doing, and that ark stayed in our backyard. And I had heard about this guy named David and how he loved God and how he was passionate, and he went out and he got all kinds of soldiers. And the first official thing this David did was he decided he was going to bring the ark of God back to Jerusalem so God's presence would be there. And it was weird. It was interesting. We were in my house at our yard, and there were 30,000 soldiers. And there were people from all over the place. And everywhere I looked, there were people that were coming down to my yard. And they brought this incredible new cart, and they put the cart on it. And I got to be in the front. I was in the front of the ark, and my brother Uzzah was in the back. And we were moving it, and they were singing and dancing and celebrating in ways that I could never imagine. They were singing songs, and everyone was full of joy. And David was the one that was leading it, and he was passionate about it. He was singing to God with every ounce of his being, and it was incredible. And all of a sudden, we got to the threshing floor, and something horrible happened. My brother Uzzah noticed that the ark was about to tip over because the ox stumbled, and all he did was reach out his hand. And God killed him immediately right there. My brother was just trying to protect the ark. And David had the audacity to be angry. David was mad, and he was angry, and he stopped the procession, and he took the ark, and he sent it to somebody else. And my brother was killed because of David's mistake. Because David failed to do something, I lost my brother. I'm mad at God. Why would God strike an innocent person who had nothing to do except for trying to steady the ark? I don't get it. I don't understand what was going on. Let's read what happens in 2 Samuel. David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. That was just his soldiers. And in 2 Chronicles, we're told about all kinds of other details. He and all of his men went to Baal in Judah to bring up the ark of God, which is called by the name. I want you to pay attention to how the author goes through great detail to let you know how holy this ark is. It was called by the name, the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubims on the ark. They set the ark of God on a new cart, brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, if we know from the history that they're actually grandsons, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nakon, Uzzah reached out his hand, took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. We're going to come back to this word later, his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day the place is called Perez Uzzah. Why did David get angry? I want you to think about when you make a mistake, why you get angry. When you do something and you mess up, did you know that most people's immediate response is to get angry? Our immediate response is to get angry. The reason I think David was angry was he was embarrassed. He had 30,000 soldiers, the entire nation of Israel, people all the way from Egypt, and he was embarrassed. I was debating whether or not if it was okay to show this picture in church or not. You can tell me later if you think it's not appropriate, and I won't do it the next service. But whenever we mess up, it's embarrassing. When we mess up our finances, or we break up a relationship, or when we do something that hurts other people, most of us are embarrassed. And the easiest response when we're embarrassed, instead of thinking about what we did, is to blame somebody else and to not talk about it. In fact, I want you to think about, how do you tell your stories? When you tell stories of your mistakes, do you tell the part about what you did and how you messed up? Or do you tell about what everyone else did that caused that to happen to you? When you tell the story, do you talk about, my whole industry was messed up. Everything they did was wrong. They talked so mean to me. A lot of times what happens to us, and I know what happens to me, is whenever I mess up, I'm embarrassed, I'm ashamed, I don't want anyone else to know. So what I do is I only tell the parts of the story where I'm kind of the hero. In fact, I have the ability, and maybe you do as well, where I could take a story where I messed up and I make myself look really good afterwards. People hear the story and they go, oh my goodness, I should probably get you some Twins tickets because it went so bad for you, and I can't believe they treated you that way. He was misunderstood. I love this picture of this baby. You know, David was passionate about God. And he wanted the entire nation to have God as the center of their worship. And I guarantee when David was there, his intentions were good. And I want you to think about it for a minute. Whenever we make a mistake, do you ever think to yourself before you make a mistake, I'm going to mess up my whole life? I'm going to hurt everybody I know and destroy our finances and make everything miserable. That's what I intended when I got up this morning. You see, what ends up happening to us when we make a mistake, we can't get past what we intended to do. And all we see is that we really wanted to make it better for someone. And I've learned in the past from past mistakes that on Mother's Day, you build up women and then you tear men down on Father's Day. We're not going to do that today, so guys, you can take a deep breath. When you get in an argument with your spouse and you say some harsh things, do you think about what you intended or what you actually did? Do you have the emotional wherewithal to be able to get past what you wanted to do to what you actually did? You see, David was angry, and anger is an incredible emotion because what it does is it helps us to deflect things away from us to other people. It helps us so that we don't have to take responsibility for what's going on in the actual situation. David was also not only experiencing anger, but he was experiencing a deeper emotion. Anger is always a secondary emotion. And almost always, whenever someone's angry, there's really something else going on under the surface, and we get to see that. David was afraid of the Lord that day. Here's David, a man after God's own heart who was leading the entire nation of Israel. And because of what happened on that threshing floor, because of his mistake, he was terrified of God. I want you to think about something before we move on. Have you ever been afraid of God? Because if you haven't, you might not be worshiping the God of the universe, because that God that we worship in the Bible, we should at least have some reverent fear of, and we should pay attention to who he is. And that day, David was afraid of God. And I think what was going on inside of David is he was wondering, is if God is going to do this to Uzzah, what about me? If I make a mistake, does that mean that God's going to strike me down? Does that mean that I'm going to experience those kind of immediate consequences? And I think David was terrified, and I think that's the same thing that happens to all of us. Some of you have wanted to have a relationship with God, but because you can't control God, because God isn't something you can put in a box, you're full of fear, and you're not quite sure you're willing to go in it. Some of you have never really decided, is God's presence a good thing or a bad thing? Is it something I should be afraid of, or is it something that will bring benefit to my life? And we think that it will bring benefit to our life, and when we do, then we move into God's presence. And some of you are terrified of God's presence, and that's what keeps you from God. So David stopped the procession that day. He had made a mistake, and he was afraid of God, and the fear is what was driving him. Verse 10, he was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. As a result of what happened to Uzzah, David said, I'm not doing it. He stopped the procession, the 30,000 people, and said, we're taking the ark somewhere else because I don't want it near me. Verse 11, the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire house. David had some time to reflect. David had some time to consider what was taking place. Did you know if you want next time to be better than the last time, you're going to have to take some time to reflect on what mistakes you made and what you're going to do different in the future? And if you're not willing to reflect on your mistakes and what actually happened and what your part of it is, you will not be able to move towards a better future. Some people are wrestling with the question, how dare God strike an innocent person down for doing something that was absolutely reasonable? Anytime that we make mistakes and we hurt people, there's almost always negative consequences. There's almost always unanswered questions, and there's almost always painful emotions. And those three things get together whenever we make a mistake. And we wrestle with, how could that happen? How did God do that? Why did God allow that? And sometimes we're wrestling with those kind of questions, and that's what gets our entire focus. And we're not willing to, even for a second, pay attention to what our part was. You see, the same thing happened in 1 Samuel chapter 6, and the people at that time asked an interesting question. Who can stand in the presence of the Lord? His holy God. Here's a question I want you to think about with me. Does a holy God have the right to insist that holy things be treated with reverence in the manner he prescribed? Does a holy God have the right to insist that holy things be treated with reverence in the manner he described? Does a holy God able to say, this is the only way you're allowed to do it and no other way will work? The reason I want to spend time in this story is because David did something that set him apart and made him a man after God's own heart and a leader worth following. He was willing to admit his mistakes, take responsibility for his own actions, and then make the necessary adjustments as he moved into the future. Between the first time and the second time, you see, the reason I love this because David got a second chance after 3 months of reflection. Some of you, when we make a mistake, we never even consider what our part was. All we do is get angry, blame everybody else, get kind of closed off, and continue moving forward, and we never take the time. You see, David was different in that he took 3 months to reflect and think, I wonder if there was anything I did. And he read God's law. And watch what it says. In fact, in Numbers, in Exodus, in Deuteronomy, and in other places, it tells about the instructions. I'm only going to give us one in Numbers chapter 4, verse 15. After Aaron and his sons have finished covering the holy furnishings and the holy articles, when the camp is ready to move, anytime you're going to move the ark, listen to this. Only then are the Kohathites, that's a special clan of Levites, to come and do the carrying. But they must not touch the holy things, or they will die. From the very first time the ark existed, he said, this is holy because God's presence is here, and anytime anyone touches this other than in the prescribed way, immediately the result will be death. Immediately. But they must not touch the holy things or they will die. The Kohathites are to carry those things that are in the tent of meetings. The way that God prescribed it was that only the Kohathites, who were a special clan of Levites, could carry the ark, and they could only do it in reverence after they've consecrated themselves with poles. Here's the passages that talk about the instructions for carrying the ark. You see, I want you to notice what David did that set him apart and made him different. But I don't only want you to notice it, I want you to consider that maybe this is what you could do between the first time you make a mistake and the second time. Because if you're like me, you're going to be pushing that button over and over. It's likely that if you've gotten in one argument with your spouse and it didn't end well, you're probably going to get in another argument. It's likely that if you've messed up your finances in the past, that maybe you're going to mess them up in the future. If you've hurt and broken relationships or messed up, it's likely, if you're anything like me, that you're going to make that mistake again. And watch what David did. Then David summoned Zadok and Abiathar the priest, and Uriah and Asel and Joel and Shemuth and El, and we get caught up in all these people that were Levites. And he said to them, you are the heads of the Levitical families. You and your fellow Levites are to consecrate yourself, bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, to the place I prepared for it. It was because of you the Levites did not bring up the first time that the Lord our God broke out in anger against us. We did not inquire of him about how to do it in the prescribed way. I want you to pay attention to this. It was our fault. We made the mistake. God's not to blame. Nobody else's fault. It was us. It was we. We did it. I made the mistake. It was my fault. We did not inquire of him about how to do it in the prescribed way. I'm going to talk about this in the future. That God doesn't want to shame you and show you how horrible you are and that you're a shameful individual that is the scum of the earth. He wants you to have the ability to figure out what was your part, what role did you play, did you actually do anything that contributed to this situation? Quite often, whenever we mess up, I'm going to be vulnerable here and tell you what I do. You know what my first response is? My first response is to get extremely defensive. I did not do it. And then my second response is almost always to blame somebody else. And usually it's the person close to me. So the person that gets to experience my blame more than anyone else is my wife, Darlene. What do you do? After you make a mistake, do you get defensive? Do you deflect, dodge, blame other people? I think that one of the reasons that we have such a hard time blaming people is we live in a culture that's addicted to blame. Our culture wants to spend all of our time assigning blame for someone else because we don't want to be responsible for it. For some of us, it happened when we were little kids. And whenever we did something wrong, the people around us didn't accept us or the people had to punish us. And we think extremely painful emotions and thoughts whenever it comes to even considering taking ownership for it. What about you? When you make a mistake, what goes through your mind? What goes through what it is you're thinking? There's an interesting book called Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me. I love the book. It's absolutely interesting and incredible because it digs deep down under the surface to why we do really dumb things. Now, when our behavior threatens our self-concept, our ego automatically goes into hyper-defense mode, circling the wagons, begins issuing a self-justification designed to protect itself. The higher the moral, financial, emotional stakes, the more our self-concept, our very identity is threatened, and the greater the dissonance that arises, and the harder it is to admit, and the more we seek to justify ourselves to preserve our own self-image. I'm going to try to translate this for some of you. What ends up happening is anytime we act in a manner that's different than who we are or who we want to be, if we have a certain value and then we act in a manner different from that, there's something called cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is emotional pain that takes place inside of us that, wow, how did I get to that screen? I went like back 10 different screens. Okay, here we are. If I believe it's wrong to lie, and I lie, I feel emotional pain whenever I lie. And instead of dealing with the pain that I feel for me lying, it's so much easier to shift it to someone else and say, the reason I lied is because of what they were going to do to me, or because of the consequences of other people. It's the first thing we do is blame. The second thing we do is make excuses. I'm going to give you a few just to see if you are like this at all. There are 4 excuses that we use. First one is everyone else is doing it. Have you ever used that to yourself? It's normal. Everybody else is doing that. In fact, when it came to cheating on the test at school, everyone else cheats, so I really didn't do anything wrong because I was just leveling the playing field. The reason I stole supplies at church or my office was because they didn't pay me enough. It really wasn't wrong. I didn't really do anything wrong. The only reason I yelled at my kids was because I had the flu for 2 weeks and because I was extremely tired from all the working that I had going on. I can't help it. It's just who I am. You ever use this excuse? The reason I have a temper is because I'm Italian. The reason I'm stubborn is because I'm German. I'm German, so it's okay for me to say that. The reason I'm not really that emotionally engaged is because I'm Scandinavian. Sorry, Dan. Sometimes we get our identities deeply rooted in bad behavior that we have, and we justify it. Have you ever used any of these excuses? My circumstances or my situation made it happen. The only reason I acted that way is because there was traffic that was so bad, and I was exhausted, and I drank too much, and I had other things going on, and that's the only reason I acted that way. Do you have the courage to ask 2 extremely dangerous questions? For some of you, I know you won't do this because it's so easy to blame everybody else. What if the next time that you made a mistake that you would actually ask these questions? What was my part? What role did I play? What was my part? What role did I play? If I think back to the mistake I made when I got on the motorcycle, my mistake was getting on the motorcycle when he didn't have headlights. When I have an argument with my wife and I'm defensive and I don't listen, the problem was that I was defensive and I didn't listen. What role did I play? Some of you will never be able to get there, and I'm going to ask you, if you're not able to actually ask these 2 questions, maybe you'll do the alternative. And the alternative, it's an easier version, is just pay attention to how often you blame other people. Just pay attention to how often you make excuses for your behavior. Instead of asking yourself the hard questions that take courage and humility to dig deep down underneath the surface so that you can have a better future, at least ask yourself the question, why am I doing this? You might even consider asking yourself, is this going to lead me towards a better future? So the priests and the Levites, I love this. See, David reflected. He admitted his mistake. He took responsibility for it. And watch what he did. So the priest and Levite consecrated themselves in order to bring the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel. And the Levites carried the ark of God on poles on their shoulders, as Moses had commanded in accordance to God's will. After taking time to reflect, he admitted it was his fault. He took responsibility, and then he made the necessary adjustments. Did you know that you will continue to make mistake after mistake over and over if you don't take time to reflect? I get it. I understand. It's so easy to blame everyone else. It's so easy to just shift the buck and deny and dodge and move and weave and not take responsibility for anything. But I promise you, if you continue to do that, you will take the same mistakes into the future. The only way that you can have the kind of future that you really want is if you're willing to ask yourself the hard questions. What was my part? What was my role? What did I contribute to this? How do you prepare yourself for a fresh start? How do you make sure that you don't make the same mistake over and over again? You have to admit your mistakes, take responsibility for your part, and make the necessary adjustments. Would you pray with me? Dear God, I know there's people in this room, and they have the same fight, and they continue to make the same mistake. And God, my prayer is today would be the day when the cycle is broken. God, I pray that you would give us as a congregation the courage to look past blaming and making excuses to the only thing that's actually helpful, which is to consider, what did I do? What was my part? How can I take responsibilities and move into the future you have for me? God, I can see a day when people decide to take responsibility, and instead of being enslaved by the misery of their decisions, they are free. God, I pray for husbands and wives who are so disconnected and so miserable. If you could just allow them to focus on their part and they could make a shift, a legacy and a family could be entirely different. God, I pray that you would move through us to accomplish your purposes. In Jesus' precious and holy name, amen. Do me a favor, stand up, greet someone for at least 44 seconds, okay? May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he cause his face to shine upon you, and every single day of your life give you his love and his joy and his mercy. Amen.